Millionaire notices. His maid. Hiding her broken wrist. By morning. What he did. Shocked everyone. Millionaire notices. His maid. Hiding her broken wrist. By morning, what he did shocked everyone. Through the gleaming kitchen of the mansion, Sophia moved like a shadow, her footsteps quiet against the polished marble floor. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching on the chrome appliances and creating patterns of light that danced across the countertops. She'd arrived earlier than usual, hoping to finish her tasks before the pain in her wrist became unbearable. Her uniform sleeve carefully covered the swelling, but beneath the crisp fabric, angry purple bruises mapped the damage. Each movement sent sharp needles of pain shooting up her arm, but she pressed her lips together, determined not to make a sound. The kitchen needed to be spotless. It was her responsibility, after all. Mr. Alexander was particular about cleanliness, and she couldn't risk losing this job. Not when she had bills to pay, and that sweet stray dog's veterinary costs to consider. Just a few more dishes, she whispered to herself, reaching for a plate in the dish rack. The simple motion caused her to inhale sharply, her good hand instinctively moving to cradle her injured wrist. The plate wobbled precariously, and she quickly steadied it, her heart pounding at the near accident. The morning light caught the swelling that had begun to peek out from beneath her sleeve. Sophia tugged the fabric down hurriedly, glancing around the empty kitchen. The silence reassured her that no one had witnessed her moment of weakness. She continued working methodically, adapting her movements to favor her good hand. The kitchen was her sanctuary in this massive house, usually quiet at this hour, allowing her to work in peace. But today, each task felt like a mountain to climb. Wiping down the counter proved especially challenging. The circular motions required both hands, and she couldn't suppress a grimace as she forced her injured wrist to cooperate. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the effort of maintaining her composure. The sound of footsteps approaching made her straighten up quickly, ignoring the protest from her injury. Alexander's tall figure appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the spacious kitchen. Sophia kept her head down, focusing on her work, hoping he wouldn't notice anything amiss. "Good morning, Sophia," his deep voice carried across the kitchen. There was something in his tone, concern, perhaps, that made her nervous. "Good morning, Mr. Alexander," she responded softly, turning slightly to acknowledge him, while keeping her injured wrist hidden behind her back. He moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. "I've noticed something's different about your work pattern these past few days." Sophia's heart rate accelerated. Had she been too slow? Too careful? Had her attempts to hide her injury affected her efficiency? "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Yes, sir. Everything's fine," she answered quickly. Too quickly. As if to betray her words, she reached for another plate and couldn't contain a sharp intake of breath as pain shot through her wrist. Alexander moved swiftly to her side, his presence both commanding and concerned. "Show me your hand, Sophia." She hesitated, her injured hand trembling slightly behind her back. The weight of his gaze made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "Please," he added, his tone brooking no argument but somehow remaining kind. Slowly, reluctantly, she brought her hand forward. The sleeve slid back, revealing the swollen, discolored skin beneath. Alexander's sharp intake of breath told her exactly how bad it looked. "This needs medical attention," he said firmly, his businesslike tone returning. "I'm taking you to the doctor, now." "Please, Mr. Alexander, I can't," she started, panic rising in her throat. "I need this job. I can still work, I promise." His expression softened slightly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Your job isn't at risk, Sophia, but your health is my concern right now. Get your coat. We're going to the emergency room. Sophia stood frozen, torn between relief and anxiety. The genuine concern in his eyes made her want to trust him, but years of self-reliance made it difficult to accept help. She began, but Alexander was already reaching for his car keys. This isn't a request, he said gently but firmly. Let me help you. The fluorescent lights of the waiting room cast harsh shadows across Sophia's face as she sat rigidly in the uncomfortable plastic chair. Her injured wrist rested in her lap, while her good hand fidgeted with the hem of her uniform. The steady hum of medical equipment and distant conversations filled the sterile air. Alexander sat beside her, his usual commanding presence somehow softened in the clinical environment. His Italian leather shoes and tailored suit looked out of place among the worn linoleum floors and dated magazines. He checked his watch, not out of impatience, but concern. The doctor will be with us shortly, he said, his voice low and reassuring. Sophia nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the institutional artwork hanging on the wall opposite them. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the house, embarrassment coloring her cheeks a pale pink. The forms she'd filled out one-handed sat completed on the clipboard between them. A nurse appeared at the doorway. Sofia Martinez? Alexander stood first, offering his hand to help Sophia up. She hesitated before accepting, careful to use her uninjured hand. They followed the nurse through winding corridors to an examination room, where the sharp smell of antiseptic made Sophia's nose wrinkle. The doctor will be right in, the nurse said, closing the door behind her. Sophia perched on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her. Alexander took the chair in the corner, maintaining a respectful distance while still showing his support. The silence between them felt heavy with unasked questions. The door opened again, and Dr. Roberts entered, her white coat pristine and her manner businesslike but kind. Ms. Martinez, I'm Dr. Roberts. Let's take a look at that wrist. Sophia extended her arm, wincing as the doctor gently examined the swollen joint. Dr. Roberts' fingers moved professionally over the injury, noting Sophia's reactions to different pressure points. How did this happen? Dr. Roberts asked, reaching for her tablet to make notes. Sophia's gaze dropped to the floor. It was just an accident. Alexander leaned forward slightly in his chair, his attention sharp. He'd been wondering about the cause since he'd first noticed her favoring her wrist. Dr. Roberts paused in her typing. We need to know the mechanism of injury to properly treat it. Sophia took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. There was this dog, a stray. He was about to run into traffic on Mason Street. She glanced quickly at Alexander before continuing. I saw the car coming, and there wasn't time to think. I just moved. You threw yourself in front of a car to save a stray dog? Dr. Roberts asked, her eyebrows rising. Alexander sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never left Sophia's face. He was so small, Sophia explained, her voice stronger now. I managed to grab him, but I fell awkwardly on my wrist. The car stopped in time, but... She gestured to her swollen joint. When did this happen? Dr. Roberts asked, making more notes. 3 days ago, Sophia admitted quietly. Alexander's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of his reaction. 3 days she'd been working, cleaning his house, preparing his meals, all with a broken wrist. We'll need x-rays to confirm, but based on the swelling and point tenderness, I'm quite certain it's broken, Dr. Roberts said, already writing up the imaging order. Why did you wait so long to seek treatment? Sophia's shoulders hunched slightly. I couldn't. I needed to work, and the dog needed help too. I used my savings to take him to the vet first. The silence that followed her confession was broken only by the soft scratching of Dr. Roberts' pen. Alexander sat motionless in his chair, his expression softening as he studied the young woman before him. In that moment, he saw beyond the quiet maid who cleaned his house. He saw someone whose compassion far outweighed her concern for herself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors as Alexander helped Sophia through the mansion's grand entrance. Her wrist was now properly bandaged and supported in a cast, but the pain medication hadn't fully kicked in yet. She moved carefully, her steps measured and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Alexander, but I really should get back to work," Sophia said, already eyeing the cleaning supplies in the nearby utility closet. "The dining room still needs—" "Absolutely not." Alexander's voice was firm but gentle. Doctor's orders were clear: rest and elevation for at least 24 hours. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, her good hand fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. "But my duties—" "Can wait," he finished for her. "Come, let's get you settled in the living room." Despite her protests, Alexander guided her toward the plush sofa in his rarely used living room. The space felt almost too formal, with its expensive artwork and pristine furniture that seemed to exist more for show than comfort. He helped her sit down, carefully arranging a pillow to elevate her injured wrist. "I'll get you some water for those pain pills," he said, turning toward the kitchen. "Mr. Alexander," Sophia called after him, her voice small but determined. "I can't accept payment for today if I'm not working." He paused mid-stride, turning back to face her. The late afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows highlighted the worry lines creasing her forehead. "Consider it paid medical leave," he said simply, continuing to the kitchen. When he returned with water and her prescribed medication, Sophia was sitting exactly where he'd left her, looking as out of place as a sparrow in a crystal palace. He handed her the water and pills, then settled into an adjacent armchair, loosening his tie slightly. "The dog," he said after a moment of awkward silence. "The one you saved. Is it okay?" Sophia's face brightened slightly at the mention of the dog. "Yes, he's at the shelter now. They said he just needed some food and basic care." She paused, taking a sip of water. "I visit him when I can." Alexander nodded, surprised by how much he wanted to keep the conversation going. "Have you always been fond of animals?" "Ever since I was little," she replied, relaxing slightly into the sofa. "My grandmother used to say I had a habit of bringing home every stray in the neighborhood." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, the first he'd seen all day. "And now you're throwing yourself in front of cars to save them," Alexander observed, his tone gentle but concerned. Sophia's cheeks flushed. "I know it wasn't the smartest thing to do, but—" She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes you just have to act, you know? When something needs help, you help. That's what my grandmother taught me." Alexander studied her for a moment, struck by the simple wisdom in her words. In his world of business deals and bottom lines, such straightforward compassion was rare. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Sophia said softly. "She raised me after my parents." She trailed off, then seemed to catch herself. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be bothering you with personal stories." "You're not bothering me," Alexander said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Actually, it's nice to have someone to talk to. This house can get quiet." Sophia glanced around the immaculate room, taking in the expensive furnishings that seemed barely used. "It is a beautiful home," she offered. "Beautiful, yes," Alexander agreed, his eyes scanning the perfect, impersonal space. "But sometimes I wonder if that's enough." The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise them both. A comfortable silence settled between them as the evening light slowly faded, casting the room in soft shadows. For the first time since she'd started working in his house, the air felt different, less formal, more real. "Would you like some tea?" Alexander asked, standing up. "I think I remember how to use the kettle." A genuine smile crossed Sophia's face. "That would be nice, thank you." Morning sunlight streamed through the guest room's heavy curtains as Alexander stood outside the door, hesitating before knocking. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying their conversation from the previous evening. It felt strange having someone else stay in his usually empty house. But stranger still was how natural it felt. He knocked softly. "Sophia? Are you awake?" "Yes, come in," her quiet voice called from inside. Alexander opened the door to find Sophia already dressed in casual clothes he'd sent someone to fetch from her apartment the night before. She sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to button her cardigan with one hand. "Here, let me help," he offered, stepping forward. She tensed slightly, but allowed him to assist with the buttons. "Thank you. I'm not used to feeling so helpless." "You're not helpless," Alexander said firmly. "You're injured. There's a difference." He stepped back, studying her face. The pain medication had helped her sleep, but dark circles still lingered under her eyes. "How's the pain this morning?" "Better," she said, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. "I should probably get started on—" "Nothing," Alexander interrupted. "You're not working today, or for the next few days at least." Sophia's shoulders slumped. "Mr. Alexander, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't afford to take that much time off." "You'll be paid for your recovery time," he assured her. "And please, just Alexander is fine." He moved to open the curtains fully, letting more sunshine fill the room. "Have you had breakfast?" She shook her head. "Well, that's something I can actually help with. I make a decent omelet, believe it or not." A hint of surprise crossed Sophia's face. "You cook?" "Occasionally," he admitted with a small smile. "When I'm not burning things." This earned him a quiet laugh, the sound making the large house feel somehow warmer. In the kitchen, Alexander insisted Sophia sit at the counter while he worked. She watched with barely concealed amusement as he navigated his own kitchen, opening several wrong drawers before finding the spatula. "You really don't have to do this," she said. But her protest lacked conviction, as the smell of cooking eggs and cheese filled the air. "I want to," he replied simply, sliding a perfectly cooked omelet onto a plate. "Besides, it's nice having company for breakfast for a change." They ate in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming the kitchen. Alexander noticed how Sophia's eyes kept drifting to the window overlooking the backyard. "Would you like to sit outside?" he asked. "The morning air might do you good." She nodded gratefully, and he helped her gather her things, a light blanket, her medication, and a glass of water, before leading her to the covered porch that wrapped around the house. As they settled into the comfortable outdoor furniture, a familiar bark caught their attention. Across the street, at the small local shelter, the stray dog she'd saved was visible in the exercise yard. His tail wagged furiously as he spotted Sophia, and she lifted her good hand in a small wave. "He remembers you," Alexander observed, watching as the dog pressed against the fence, trying to get closer. "Animals remember kindness," Sophia said softly, her eyes fixed on the dog. "They're better than people that way." Alexander studied her profile as she watched the dog play. There was something both strong and fragile about her, like a dancer balancing on point, capable of incredible strength while remaining delicate. The thought struck him as oddly specific, and he filed it away to examine later. The dog barked again, drawing their attention. He was running in circles now, showing off for his audience of two. "He's quite the performer," Alexander commented, noting how Sophia's face had brightened watching the dog's antics. "He just wants someone to notice him," she replied, a hint of sadness in her voice. "Sometimes that's all anyone really wants." Something in her words resonated deeply with Alexander. He watched as she continued to observe the dog, her injured wrist cradled protectively in her lap, and made a mental note to contact the shelter as soon as possible. Perhaps there was a way to bring a little more joy into both their lives. Alexander pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, glancing at his passenger in the rearview mirror. The dog sat quietly in the back seat, its head tilted as if trying to understand its sudden change in fortune. After signing the adoption papers and getting the dog cleaned up at the groomer's, Alexander felt oddly nervous about his impulsive decision. "Well, this is home now," he told the dog, who responded with a gentle wag of its tail. He spotted Sophia through the living room window, reading a book with her injured wrist propped carefully on a pillow. Taking a deep breath, he opened the back door of his car. The dog hopped out, staying close to his side as they walked toward the front entrance. "Wait here," Alexander whispered, leaving the dog sitting patiently by the door. He stepped inside, finding Sophia exactly where he'd seen her. "I have something to show you." She looked up, curious. "What is it?" "Close your eyes," he said, surprising himself with how playful he sounded. When she hesitated, he added, "Please? Trust me." Sophia set her book down and closed her eyes, a slight smile playing at her lips. Alexander opened the door, and the dog trotted in, immediately recognizing Sophia. Its tail began wagging furiously. "Okay, open them." Sophia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she just stared. The dog sat there, freshly groomed and wearing a new blue collar, looking up at her with adoring eyes. Her mouth fell open, and she glanced between Alexander and the dog, speechless. Did you... She couldn't seem to finish her sentences. "He needed a home," Alexander said simply, "and you needed a friend." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as the dog approached her cautiously. She held out her good hand, and the dog immediately pressed his head against it, letting out a contented sigh. "I can't believe you did this," she whispered. "Well, you did save his life," Alexander reminded her, settling into the armchair across from them. "It seemed only fair that he get to thank you properly." The dog had already made himself comfortable at Sophia's feet, rolling over to expose his belly. She laughed softly, wiping away a tear as she reached down to pet him. "But the responsibility, the expenses, are all taken care of," Alexander assured her. "He's technically my dog, but I think we both know who he's really going to belong to." Sophia looked up at him, and the gratitude in her eyes made his chest tighten. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "Just enjoy having him around." They sat in comfortable silence as Sophia bonded with the dog, who seemed to understand exactly how careful he needed to be around her injured wrist. Alexander watched as the dog rested his head in her lap, his eyes closing contentedly as she stroked his ears. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. Alexander found himself studying Sophia's face as she interacted with the dog, noticing how her usual guarded expression had softened into something more open and vulnerable. Despite her injury, despite whatever struggles she was clearly carrying, her first instinct had been to save this dog, to put herself in harm's way for a creature that needed help. The dog rolled over again, pressing against Sophia's legs as if trying to get even closer. She smiled down at him, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. There was something remarkable about her quiet strength, her instinctive kindness. Starting scene. Sophia is sitting on the floor with the dog, reminiscing about the time she spent taking care of animals in her youth. Alexander, curious, presses her for more details. Ending scene. She reluctantly opens up, revealing that she was once a professional ballerina before an injury ended her career. She hides her shame, feeling like she's not the same person anymore. The evening sun cast long shadows through the mansion's windows as Alexander watched Sophia gently stroke the dog's fur. Her earlier revelation about being a ballerina weighed heavily on his mind. He noticed how, even with her injured wrist, her movements held an innate grace that spoke of years of training. "You still move like a dancer," he said softly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Sophia's hand stilled on the dog's head. "Old habits," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. "They're hard to break." Alexander moved from his armchair to sit on the floor beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Why would you want to break them? Those habits made you who you are." "Who I was," she corrected, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog sensed her distress and nuzzled closer to her. "The injury doesn't erase your talent or your passion," Alexander said. He watched as she absently rubbed her old injury, a gesture he'd noticed she did when lost in thought. "Tell me about it. About dancing. What did you love most about it?" Sophia's eyes grew distant, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The freedom," she said after a moment. "When I danced, nothing else existed. It was just me and the music, and this feeling of floating, like I could do anything." "That doesn't sound like something that just goes away," Alexander observed. "It doesn't," she admitted, her voice catching. "But what good is loving something you can't do anymore?" Alexander shifted, leaning forward slightly. "Who says you can't?" "My body does. Every time I think about it, every time I see dancers perform." She trailed off, swallowing hard. "I'll never be what I was." "Maybe you're not supposed to be what you were," Alexander said gently. "Maybe you're supposed to be something new." Sophia looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the raw vulnerability in her eyes. "I don't know how to be something new when I still miss what I was so much." "Then don't let it go completely," he suggested. "Dance doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be about performing or being the best. It can just be about that freedom you talked about." The dog had dozed off, its head resting on Sophia's lap. She stroked its ears thoughtfully. "I haven't danced in so long," she whispered. "I'm afraid to try." "What are you really afraid of?" Alexander asked, his voice gentle but probing. Sophia's hands trembled slightly. "Failing. Again. Discovering that even the simple joy of movement is gone forever." "But what if it isn't?" Alexander stood up and walked to the large windows overlooking the garden. "You know, I have a room here. It used to be a small ballroom. It's empty now, has been for years. Hardwood floors, mirrors on one wall." He turned back to face her. "It's private. Nobody would have to know." Sophia's breath caught. "Alexander, the room is yours if you want it," he said simply. "No pressure, no expectations, just a space where you can remember who you are." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. The dog stirred in her lap, and she gently moved it aside to stand up. Her movements, despite her effort to hide it, had the controlled precision of a dancer. "You don't have to decide now," Alexander added, seeing her internal struggle. "The room isn't going anywhere." Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, as if holding something precious inside. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because everyone deserves a chance to hold on to what they love," he replied, thinking of his own empty life, filled with material success but little joy. "Even if it's different from before." She nodded slowly, and Alexander saw something shift in her expression, a tiny spark of hope that hadn't been there before. The dog padded over to her, pressing against her legs supportively. "I'll think about it," she said finally, and though her voice was quiet, there was a new strength in it. Later that night, after Alexander had retired to his study, Sophia stood alone in her room. She raised her arms in a familiar position, muscle memory taking over despite the years of disuse. In the privacy of darkness, she allowed herself to sway slightly, testing the movement. For the first time in years, she felt the whisper of something she thought she'd lost forever: the desire to dance again. Alexander parked his Mercedes outside the weathered brick building of the Metropolitan Ballet Academy. The familiar gold lettering on the window had faded over the years, but the studio still held an air of elegance. Through the large windows, he could see young dancers practicing at the bar, their movements precise and disciplined. He hesitated before entering, feeling out of place in his tailored suit among the dancewear and ballet slippers. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The wooden floors, worn smooth by countless dancing feet, creaked beneath his Italian leather shoes. "Can I help you?" A woman in her 60s approached him, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her posture was impeccable, and despite her age, she moved with the grace of a former dancer. "Yes, I'm looking for information about a former student," Alexander said, his voice low to avoid disturbing the class in session. "Sophia Mitchell?" The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Sophia?" She studied him more carefully now. "I'm Margaret Weber, the owner. Perhaps we should talk in my office?" Alexander followed her down a narrow hallway lined with photographs of performances past. He couldn't help but scan them, wondering if he'd spot Sophia among the faces. Margaret's office was small but neat, with more photographs on the walls and a desk covered in rehearsal schedules. She gestured for him to sit. "It's been years since anyone's asked about Sophia. Are you family?" "No, I'm—" Alexander paused, unsure how to explain their relationship. "She works for me. I recently learned about her past as a dancer, and I wanted to understand more." Margaret's expression softened. "Sophia was one of our brightest stars. Such natural talent, but more than that, she had something special. When she danced, people couldn't look away." She reached for a photo album on her shelf. "Here." The photograph showed a younger Sophia in mid-leap, her body suspended in the air with impossible grace. Her face was radiant with joy, completely lost in the moment. Alexander found himself staring at the image, trying to reconcile it with the guarded woman he knew. "What happened?" he asked, though he already knew parts of the story. Margaret sighed, closing the album gently. The accident wasn't her fault. A wet stage, a moment's loss of balance, it could have happened to anyone. But Sophia, she couldn't forgive herself. The physical recovery was difficult, but the emotional toll was worse. She withdrew from everyone, stopped coming to the studio even to watch. It was like she tried to erase that part of herself completely. Alexander listened intently, noting the sadness in Margaret's voice. Could she dance again? Physically, I mean. With proper rehabilitation and training, yes. The injury healed well enough. But Sophia's biggest obstacle was never physical. It was fear. Fear of failing. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of loving something so much only to lose it again. "She still loves it," Alexander said quietly. "I can see it when she talks about dancing, even though it hurts her." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Mr. Sterling, Alexander Sterling. Mr. Sterling, Sophia had a gift. Not just technical skill. Many dancers have that. She had the ability to make people feel something when she danced. That doesn't go away, even if the body changes." Alexander nodded, thinking of the empty ballroom in his mansion. Do you still teach private lessons? For the right student, Margaret replied carefully. Someone who's ready to face their fears. What would it take, Alexander asked, to help someone find their way back? Margaret studied him for a long moment. Patience, understanding, a safe space to fail and try again. But most importantly, they have to want it for themselves. No one else can make that choice for them. Alexander stood, extending his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Weber. You've been very helpful. As he drove back to the mansion, his mind was already working, forming plans. The photograph of young Sophia dancing stayed with him. Not just the grace of her movement, but the pure joy on her face. He wanted to help her find that joy again, even if it looked different now. The attic air was thick with dust, making Sophia's nose twitch as she pushed aside old furniture draped in white sheets. Early morning light filtered through a small window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Her wrist, though still tender, had healed enough for gentle movement. Her heart skipped when she spotted it. An old ballet bar tucked away in the corner, its brass fixtures dulled with age. She ran her fingers along the wooden rail, memories flooding back of countless hours spent at similar bars, perfecting her form. Just a few stretches, she whispered to herself, as if making the promise would keep her from hoping for more. Sophia cleared a space, pushing boxes aside to create enough room. The floorboards seemed solid enough, though they creaked slightly under her feet. She placed her phone on an old trunk, soft piano music filling the space. Her hands trembled as they gripped the bar. The familiar position felt foreign now, her body stiff from years of avoiding these movements. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began with simple pliés. The first movements were awkward, hesitant. Her muscles protested, remembering but resistant. Still, she pressed on, working through basic positions she'd learned as a child. With each passing minute, her body began to remember, muscle memory awakening from its long slumber. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she moved through the exercises. Her previously injured leg wasn't as flexible as it once was, and her turns weren't as sharp, but something else was happening, something she hadn't expected. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. Joy. She moved away from the bar, attempting simple combinations in the center of her cleared space. Her movements were smaller, more contained than they'd been in her prime. But the essence was there. The music flowed through her, and for a moment she forgot about her injuries, her fears, her shame. As she finished a simple pirouette, slower and less precise than before, she caught a glimpse of herself in an old mirror propped against the wall. The woman reflected there wasn't the prima ballerina she'd once been, but she wasn't the broken person she'd thought herself to be either. She was something in between, something new. Lost in the moment, she didn't hear the attic door open. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, transfixed. The morning light caught the dust motes swirling around Sophia as she moved, creating an ethereal effect. Despite the makeshift studio and her simple clothes, there was an undeniable grace to her movements that took his breath away. He watched as she attempted another turn, wobbling slightly but maintaining her balance. Her face showed both concentration and something else, a hint of the joy he'd seen in that old photograph at the studio. When she opened her eyes and saw him, she stumbled, her face flushing deep red. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, reaching to stop the music. "I shouldn't be up here. I'll clean everything up right away." "Please don't," Alexander said softly, taking a step into the room. "Don't stop on my account." Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly self-conscious. I thought maybe—" "You were dancing," he said simply. "And it was beautiful." She shook her head, looking away. It's nothing like it used to be. I can barely manage the basic steps now. Alexander moved closer, careful not to startle her. Then let me help. Whatever you need, private lessons, equipment, a proper space to practice. Name it, and it's yours. I couldn't possibly— You can, he interrupted gently. And you should. I saw what just happened, Sophia. For a moment there, you were happy. Really happy. When was the last time you felt that? Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the bar, its brass fixtures catching the morning light. It's been a long time, she whispered. Then maybe it's time to change that. Alexander gestured to the space around them. This isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about discovering who you can be now. The next morning, Sophia crept back to the attic before dawn. Her conversation with Alexander had stirred something in her, a dangerous spark of hope she'd tried so hard to extinguish. The old wooden stairs groaned under her feet as she climbed, her heart pounding with anticipation. This time she'd brought proper ballet shoes she'd hidden away years ago. The pink satin was faded, the ribbons frayed, but they still fit. As she laced them up, her fingers trembled with both excitement and fear. The familiar piano music filled the space again, but today she pushed herself harder. No more simple positions and basic moves. She wanted, needed to prove she could still do more. Her body protested as she attempted more complex combinations, movements she hadn't tried in years. Just one grand jeté, she whispered to herself, ignoring the twinge in her newly healed wrist. One leap, like before. She marked the steps first, plotting her path through the cramped space. Taking a deep breath, she began the preparation, her muscles tensing for the jump. The first attempt was hesitant, barely leaving the ground. Frustrated, she tried again, pushing harder. Her third attempt had more height, more grace, but as she landed, her wrist buckled under the impact. Sharp pain shot through her arm, causing her to stumble. Still, she pressed on, determined to recapture what she'd lost. Again, she commanded herself, wiping sweat from her brow. Do it again. Each successive attempt grew more desperate, more reckless. Her breathing became ragged, her movements less controlled. The pain in her wrist increased, but she ignored it, pushing through each warning signal her body sent. During a particularly ambitious turn sequence, her wrist finally gave out completely. The room spun as she lost her balance, and she collapsed to the floor with a cry of pain. The music continued to play, a cruel backdrop to her failure. Sophia curled into herself, cradling her throbbing wrist against her chest. Tears of frustration and shame rolled down her cheeks as the reality of her limitations crashed over her. The dusty attic floor pressed cold against her cheek as she lay there, too overwhelmed to move. I can't, she whispered to the empty room. I just can't. The door creaked open, and footsteps hurried across the floor. Sophia? Alexander's voice was tight with concern. What happened? She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the disappointment she was sure would be in his eyes. But gentle hands helped her sit up, and when she finally met his gaze, she saw only worry there. Your wrist, he said, carefully examining the swollen joint. You've aggravated the injury. I had to try, she said, her voice breaking. I had to know if I could still what? Hurt yourself? His tone was stern but kind as he helped her to her feet. This isn't a race, Sophia. You can't force your body to do everything it used to do right away. She swayed slightly, letting him support her weight. You don't understand. Every day I wait, every moment I hesitate, I feel more ridiculous. A 30-year-old former ballerina trying to dance again? It's pathetic. Pathetic? Alexander's voice sharpened. Is that what you think I see when I watch you dance? Because what I see is someone brave enough to face their fears, to try again despite everything. Sophia shook her head, tears falling freely now. You saw me yesterday. Those weren't real steps, real dancing. They were just shadows of what I used to be able to do, and now, trying to do more. She gestured helplessly at her wrist. I can't even manage a simple jump without falling apart. Then you start smaller, Alexander said firmly. You build back up, but not like this. Not by pushing yourself until you break. The kindness in his voice undid her completely. I'm so embarrassed, she whispered. Everyone knew me as this perfect, graceful dancer. Now I can barely complete basic combinations without hurting myself. How can I face anyone like this? The evening air was cool against Sophia's tear-stained cheeks as she sat beside Alexander on the garden bench. Her wrist, freshly wrapped with an ice pack, throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The setting sun painted the roses in shades of amber and gold, their sweet fragrance filling the air. I was 19, she said softly, breaking the silence, when I got my first leading role with the company. Her fingers absently traced patterns on the ice pack. Everything I'd worked for since I was a little girl was finally happening. Alexander listened quietly, his presence steady and reassuring beside her. The dog they'd rescued lay at their feet, occasionally lifting its head to check on them. The reviews called me promising, fresh, the future of ballet. A bitter smile crossed her face. I believed them. I thought if I just worked harder, pushed myself further, I could be everything they wanted me to be. She paused, taking a shaky breath. There was this one performance, Swan Lake. I'd been practicing non-stop for weeks. My body was exhausted, but I ignored it. During the show, something just gave out. I fell during the fouettes. 32 perfect turns, that's what everyone expects from the Black Swan. I made it to 28 before my ankle rolled. Alexander's hand found hers, careful to avoid her injured wrist. That's when the first injury happened? Sophia nodded. I tried to dance through it, kept telling myself it was just a sprain, that I could push through. But it never healed properly. Then came the wrist injury during a lift gone wrong. After that, she gestured helplessly with her good hand. The company couldn't wait forever. They needed someone reliable, someone whole. You were 21, Alexander said softly. It wasn't a question. 21 and finished. Do you know what it's like? To have everyone tell you you're finished before you've really begun? Her voice cracked. I couldn't even watch ballet after that. Couldn't bear to see others living my dream while I... She trailed off, looking down at her wrapped wrist. The dog whined softly, sensing her distress, and pressed closer to her legs. She reached down to scratch behind its ears, finding comfort in the simple gesture. I became invisible after that, she continued. It was easier that way. No expectations, no disappointment, just nothing. Until you jumped in front of a car to save this fellow, Alexander said, nodding towards the dog. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. He needed help. I didn't think about it, I just moved. That's who you are, Sophia. Someone who moves without hesitation to help others, even at cost to yourself. Alexander turned to face her fully. But you've spent so long helping others, you've forgotten how to help yourself. I don't know how anymore, she admitted. Every time I try, like today, I feel like I'm chasing ghosts, trying to be someone I used to be. Maybe that's the problem, Alexander said gently. You're not trying to be who you are now. You're trying to be who you were at 19. The truth of his words hit her hard. She'd been so focused on recapturing her past self, she hadn't considered what it might mean to dance as she was now. Your dreams didn't shatter, Sophia. They just need to change shape. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. and you don't have to figure it out alone." She looked up at him, vulnerable hope in her eyes. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "What if I try, really try, and fail again?" "Then you'll still have me," Alexander said simply. "And this guy?" He gestured to the dog, who thumped his tail against the ground. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. For so long, she'd carried her dreams like broken glass, afraid to look at them too closely for fear of cutting herself again. But here was Alexander, offering to help her piece them back together, not into what they were, but into something new. The early morning light filtered through the mansion's windows as Sophia stood before the ballet bar in the attic. Her reflection in the dusty mirror showed determination in her eyes, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the wooden bar. She began with simple exercises, the ones ingrained in her muscle memory from years of training. Plié, relevé, tendu. Each movement was deliberate, careful. The wrapping on her wrist felt tight, constraining, a constant reminder of her limitations. "Just like before," she whispered to herself, trying to recapture the grace she once possessed. But her body felt different now, heavier, more hesitant. The years away from dance had changed her in ways she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She attempted a basic turn, something she could have done in her sleep years ago. Her injured wrist protested as she tried to maintain proper form. The movement that should have been fluid became awkward, stilted. She stumbled, catching herself against the bar. Frustration bubbled up inside her chest. She tried again, pushing harder this time. The pain in her wrist sharpened, but she ignored it. Just one clean turn, that's all she wanted. One moment to prove she still had it in her. Instead, her ankle wobbled, and she lost her balance completely. She crashed to the floor, her wrist taking the brunt of the impact. Pain shot up her arm, bringing tears to her eyes. "No, no, no," she muttered, cradling her wrist. The failure felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She stayed there on the floor, her practice clothes collecting dust, as memories of her past glory mocked her current state. The door creaked open, and Alexander's worried face appeared. "Sophia, I heard a noise." His eyes widened when he saw her on the floor, and he rushed to her side. "Are you all right?" She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the words. "Let me help you up," he offered, reaching for her. "I said I'm fine!" The words came out sharper than intended. She struggled to her feet on her own, ignoring his outstretched hand. Her wrist throbbed, and her pride hurt even more. Alexander stepped back, giving her space, but his presence remained steady. "What happened?" "What happened?" She gave a bitter laugh. "What happened is that I'm fooling myself. I can't do this anymore. I'm not that person anymore." She gestured to the mirror, to her reflection that seemed to mock her. "Look at me. I can barely manage a simple turn without falling. My body doesn't work the way it used to. My wrist—" She held up her injured hand. "It's never going to be strong enough." "Sophia, no," she cut him off. "I need to stop pretending. It's too late for me. Dance isn't something you can just pick up again after years away. It requires dedication, perfection. Your body has to be—" She trailed off, fighting back tears. "I'm not 19 anymore. I'm not that promising young dancer everyone believed in. I'm just this." Alexander remained silent, letting her words fill the space between them. The morning light caught the dust motes swirling in the air, making them look like falling stars. "I should have known better," she continued, her voice quieter now. "Should have known I couldn't go back. It was stupid to even try." She walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Some dreams are meant to stay in the past. I need to accept that and move on. She turned back to Alexander, and the defeat in her eyes was painful to see. I can't do this anymore. I won't. It's too late for me to return to dance. I should just accept what I am now. The silence that followed her words felt heavy, filled with the weight of shattered dreams and lost possibilities. Through the window, the morning sun continued to rise, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in the attic of a mansion, where a former dancer finally admitted defeat. Alexander watched her for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back. The morning light filtered through the dusty attic window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where Sophia had fallen. When I first started my company, he began quietly, I failed spectacularly. He moved to lean against the ballet bar, his usually pristine suit collecting dust. I lost everything, my investors, my savings, my reputation. Sophia turned slightly, wiping away a tear with her uninjured hand. Her eyes met his in the mirror, curious despite her distress. I was young, arrogant, thought I knew everything. He smiled ruefully. The market crashed 3 months after I launched. I had to lay off 30 people, good people, with families. His fingers drummed against the bar. I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. That's different, Sophia protested weakly. Business is about numbers, strategies. Dance is about perfection, about being young and strong and what? Alexander challenged gently. About never making mistakes? Never falling? He gestured to her wrapped wrist. You saved a dog's life with this injury. Was that a mistake? She shook her head, unconsciously touching her wrist. No, but nothing. He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. You know what I learned from my failure? It's not about being perfect. It's about getting up one more time than you fall. Sophia sank onto a nearby chair, absently stroking the fabric of her practice clothes. I used to be able to do 32 fouettes without stopping, she whispered. Now I can barely manage a simple turn without falling. So start with 1, Alexander suggested. Then 2, then 3. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple at all. He knelt beside her chair, looking up into her face. It's probably one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but you've already taken the first step by trying. Tears welled up in her eyes again. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I can never dance like I used to? Then dance differently, he said simply. Dance for yourself, not for an audience. Dance because it makes you feel alive. His words hung in the air between them. Sophia's fingers twisted in her lap, her breathing uneven. How? She swallowed hard. How did you start over? After you lost everything? Alexander's eyes softened with memory. One day at a time. I took a job as a junior analyst at a competitor's firm, worked my way up from the bottom again, learned humility. He chuckled. Learned patience, which was harder. And now look at you, Sophia gestured vaguely at his expensive suit. Now look at me, he agreed, sitting in a dusty attic, trying to convince a stubborn woman that her dreams are still worth fighting for. That drew a small laugh from her, though it was watery with unshed tears. I'll make you a deal, Alexander said, standing and offering her his hand. Give it 2 more weeks, just 2 weeks. We'll find you a proper instructor, someone who understands injury rehabilitation. If after 2 weeks you still want to stop, I'll never mention dance again. Sophia looked at his offered hand, uncertainty written across her features. 2 weeks isn't very long. Long enough to try, really try. He wiggled his fingers encouragingly. What do you have to lose? She took a shaky breath, then reached out and placed her hand in his. Okay, she whispered. 2 weeks. Her voice strengthened slightly. "But I can't promise anything." Alexander helped her to her feet, careful of her injured wrist. "The only promise I want is that you'll be honest with yourself. Don't give up because you're scared. Give up only if you truly don't want to dance anymore." Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes drifting to the mirror again. In the reflection, she saw herself, not as the prima ballerina she once was, but as she was now. Injured, uncertain, but still standing. 2 weeks, she repeated, more to herself than to Alexander. Her voice carried a mix of fear and determination, like someone stepping onto a high wire without a net. Sophia's heart pounded as Alexander's car pulled up to the familiar building. The old ballet studio looked exactly as she remembered it. The weathered brick exterior, the tall windows, even the faded poster from a performance years ago still clinging to the bulletin board outside. "Alexander, why are we here?" Her voice trembled slightly. She hadn't been back since her injury, and the sight of it made her palms sweat. "Trust me," he said softly, coming around to open her door. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves of the maple trees lining the sidewalk. She hesitated before taking his offered hand. Her wrist, though healing, still ached beneath its brace. As they approached the entrance, memories flooded back, the smell of rosin, the creak of the wooden floors, the echo of piano music through the halls. Alexander guided her through the familiar corridor. The walls were still lined with photographs of past performances, and Sophia's breath caught when she spotted herself in one of them, frozen mid-leap in a performance of Swan Lake. "I can't," she whispered, stopping abruptly. "This was a mistake." "Just 5 minutes," Alexander promised, his hand gentle but firm on her lower back. "That's all I'm asking." Before she could protest further, he opened the door to Studio A, and Sophia's world shifted. Standing at the bar, warming up with the same graceful movements Sophia remembered from their years together, was Claire Bennett, her former dance partner and closest friend from her performing days. Claire turned, a warm smile spreading across her face. "There's my favorite swan." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Claire? But how?" "Your friend here can be very persuasive," Claire said, crossing the room to embrace her. "When he told me about your injury and how you've been practicing again—" She pulled back, holding Sophia at arm's length. "I couldn't stay away." Alexander cleared his throat. "Claire's been teaching here for the past 3 years. She specializes in rehabilitation and working with injured dancers." "You remembered," Sophia whispered, glancing at him. She'd mentioned Claire only once, during one of their late-night conversations. "Of course I did." He smiled softly. "I'll leave you two to catch up." As Alexander quietly slipped out, Claire led Sophia to the bar. "Let's start slow," she suggested, her voice carrying the same patient tone Sophia remembered from their years of training together. "Just some basic positions, nothing strenuous." Sophia's hands trembled as she gripped the bar. Claire stood beside her, demonstrating a simple warm-up routine modified to protect Sophia's healing wrist. "Remember when we first learned these?" Claire asked, executing a perfect plie. Madame Dubois would rap her cane on the floor. 1, 2, 3. Despite her nervousness, Sophia found herself smiling at the memory. Her body remembered the movements, even after all this time. With Claire's gentle guidance, she moved through the basic positions, each one awakening muscle memories she thought she'd lost. "Good," Claire encouraged. "Now let's try something a little different." She demonstrated a modified port de bras that wouldn't strain Sophia's wrist. "The key is to work with your body as it is now, not fight against it." As they continued, Sophia felt something shift inside her. The movements weren't as perfect as they once were, but there was a freedom in them she hadn't expected. Claire's modifications showed her new ways to express the grace she'd thought was lost forever. "You're still a dancer, Sophia," Claire said softly, watching her former partner's reflection in the mirror. "The injury changed how you dance, but it didn't take away your spirit." Tears blurred Sophia's vision, but these weren't tears of frustration or loss. For the first time in years, she felt something she'd thought was gone forever. The pure joy of movement, the electric connection between body and music, even in these simple exercises. When Alexander returned an hour later, he found Sophia and Claire sitting on the floor, talking and laughing like no time had passed. Sophia's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with an inner light he'd never seen before. She looked up at him, and the smile she gave him made his heart skip. "Thank you," she said simply, but her voice held volumes of emotion. In that moment, watching her come alive again in the morning light streaming through the studio windows, Alexander saw more than just gratitude in her eyes. He saw hope, fragile and newborn, but undeniably real. The morning sun filtered through the studio's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Sophia stood at the bar, her movements more assured than they had been in weeks. Claire's guidance had awakened something in her, a spark of the dancer she used to be, merged with who she was becoming. She began her warm-up routine, modified to protect her healing wrist. The familiar exercises felt different now, less like a reminder of what she'd lost, and more like stepping stones to something new. Her body moved with growing confidence, each position flowing naturally into the next. "Remember to breathe," Claire's voice echoed in her mind as she worked through the positions. Her muscles burned pleasantly, a sensation she'd almost forgotten. Even with the modifications, she could feel her strength returning, her body remembering its old grace while discovering new ways to move. In the mirror, she caught glimpses of herself, not the broken dancer she'd become, but someone stronger, more resilient. The brace on her wrist was no longer a symbol of limitation, but a reminder of her courage. She'd saved that dog, and now both of them had found a home in Alexander's mansion. Alexander. The thought of him made her movements softer, more fluid. He'd given her more than just a place to stay, or a chance to dance again. He'd given her permission to believe in herself. She moved away from the bar, testing her balance in the center of the room. The morning light caught her hair as she began a series of simple turns. Her injured wrist stayed close to her body, but her other arm moved freely, creating shapes in the air that felt both familiar and new. From the doorway, Alexander watched silently. He'd come to check on her, worried she might be pushing herself too hard, but what he saw stopped him in his tracks. This wasn't the hesitant woman who'd been hiding in his house. This was a dancer finding her way back to herself. Sophia continued, unaware of his presence. She moved through a sequence Claire had taught her, modified but still beautiful. Her face showed complete concentration, a small furrow between her brows as she focused on each movement. But there was joy there, too, in the slight smile that tugged at her lips, in the way she held her head high. When she stumbled slightly, she didn't crumble as she might have days ago. Instead, she paused, took a breath, and began again. The determination in her eyes made Alexander's chest tighten with emotion. She was transforming before his eyes, and it wasn't just her dancing. It was the way she carried herself now, the quiet confidence that had begun to emerge. She no longer hunched her shoulders or tried to make herself invisible. She was claiming her space in the world again, one step at a time. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, mesmerized. Her movements were still careful, still mindful of her healing wrist, but they held a grace that took his breath away. This wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about persistence, about finding beauty in the journey rather than just the destination. The morning light caught the sheen of perspiration on her skin as she moved, making her glow. Her hair had come loose from its bun, tendrils framing her face as she danced. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. His heart swelled with pride and something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken. He recognized the feeling, though he tried to deny it. Watching her grow stronger each day, seeing her face light up when she mastered a new movement, witnessing her quiet determination, he was falling in love with all of it, with all of her. She spun once more, and this time when she stumbled, she laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed through the studio. It was the sound of someone who had remembered how to find joy in imperfection, how to embrace the present moment, instead of mourning the past. Alexander remained in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt her practice. He would stay there as long as he could, watching her dance, watching her heal, watching her become. Sophia stood in the middle of the practice room, her reflection fractured across the wall of mirrors. Morning light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Her wrist ached, a dull reminder of both her injury and her rescue of the dog that now slept peacefully in the corner of the room. She lifted her arms into first position, feeling the familiar stretch in her shoulders. The movement brought both comfort and anxiety, a contradiction that had become all too familiar lately. Her body remembered the positions, but fear still lingered in every movement. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, lowering her arms. The question echoed in the empty studio, bouncing off the mirrors like the doubts in her mind. She walked to the bar, running her fingers along its smooth surface. How many hours had she spent here, pushing herself, dreaming of perfection? The dog stirred in his sleep, letting out a small whimper. Sophia smiled, remembering the moment she'd thrown herself in front of that car. She hadn't hesitated then, hadn't worried about the consequences or what it might cost her. She'd simply acted, driven by something deeper than fear. Her wrist twinged again as she adjusted the brace. Claire, her former colleague, had shown her modified positions that would protect her injury while still allowing her to dance. "The choice is yours," Claire had said after their lesson. "But remember, dancing isn't just about being perfect. It's about being alive." Sophia closed her eyes, remembering the feeling of moving across the floor yesterday. Despite her limitations, despite her fears, there had been moments when everything else had fallen away. In those brief seconds, she'd felt whole again. She opened her eyes and met her reflection's gaze. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same person who'd first arrived at Alexander's mansion. That woman had been hiding, not just from dance, but from life itself. Now, something had changed. Walking to the center of the room, Sophia began her warm-up routine. Each movement was a question, a choice. Her body moved through the familiar patterns, while her mind wrestled with the decision before her. Could she really do this? Could she find a new way to dance, one that acknowledged her limitations without being defined by them? The dog padded over to her, tail wagging. He sat nearby, watching her with those trusting eyes that had started this whole journey. Sophia paused, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You didn't care if I was a dancer or not, did you?" she murmured. "You just needed someone to believe in you." Standing straight again, she moved through a series of simple turns. Her injured wrist stayed close to her body, but her other arm moved freely, creating shapes in the air. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect again. But there was beauty in it, nonetheless. Memories flooded back. Her first ballet class, her debut performance, the countless hours of practice. But now they felt different. Instead of reminders of what she'd lost, they became building blocks for something new. She didn't have to be the dancer she was before. She could be something else, something stronger, more resilient. The morning light shifted, creating new patterns on the floor. Sophia moved through them, her shadow dancing alongside her. Each step felt like a decision, each movement a choice between holding on to the past and embracing an uncertain future. She thought of Alexander, how he'd seen something in her worth saving even when she couldn't see it herself. He'd given her space to heal, to question, to discover who she could be now. His quiet support had shown her that sometimes strength meant asking for help, and that vulnerability didn't equal weakness. As she completed another turn, Sophia felt something settle inside her. The choice had been there all along, waiting for her to be ready. She didn't have to give up dancing. She just had to dance differently. Her injury would always be part of her story, but it didn't have to be the end of it. She walked to her bag and pulled out her old point shoes. They were worn and familiar in her hands. Setting them aside, she reached for her soft ballet slippers instead. Starting small didn't mean giving up. It meant being smart, being patient, being kind to herself. "Okay," she said aloud, slipping on the shoes. "Let's begin again." The morning light streamed through the studio windows as Sophia prepared for her daily practice. She'd fallen into a comfortable routine over the past weeks, warming up slowly, working through modified positions, and gradually building her strength. But today felt different from the moment she stepped onto the floor. A dull ache pulsed in her wrist as she moved through her first stretches. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her breathing and the gentle music playing from the speakers. The dog lay in his usual spot by the mirror, watching her with attentive eyes. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, adjusting her wrist brace. "Just need to warm up properly." But as she moved into her first series of movements, the ache transformed into a sharp, stabbing pain. She faltered mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. The familiar positions that had become comfortable again now felt impossible, each movement sending waves of discomfort up her arm. "No, please," she muttered, dropping her arms. "Not now." She tried again, this time moving more cautiously. The pain intensified, forcing her to stop completely. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes as she cradled her wrist against her chest. The dog sensed her distress and padded over, nudging her leg with his nose. The next few days passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and worried looks from Alexander. The diagnosis was clear. She'd overworked the injured joint, and it needed complete rest to heal. No dancing, no practice, not even the gentlest of movements. Sophia sat in her room, staring at her ballet slippers lying abandoned in the corner. The familiar smell of leather and rosin that usually brought comfort now seemed to mock her. She'd been foolish to think she could just pick up where she'd left off, even with modifications. "You haven't touched your dinner," Alexander said softly from the doorway. He'd been bringing her meals up, respecting her need for space while making sure she knew she wasn't alone. "I'm not hungry," she replied, not meeting his eyes. The shame of failure sat heavy in her stomach, leaving no room for appetite. The dog lay at her feet, his head on her slippers as if guarding them. She remembered the moment she'd decided to save him, how instinctive it had been. There had been no doubt then, no second guessing. Now, doubt was all she had. Days stretched into a week. The studio remained empty, dust gathering on the bar where her hands had so recently found their strength again. Each morning, she woke hoping the pain would be gone, only to find it lingering like an unwelcome guest. "Perhaps I was just kidding myself," she confided to the dog one afternoon, sitting on the floor beside her bed. "Thinking I could dance again? Maybe some dreams are meant to stay in the past. The initial excitement of returning to dance faded, replaced by a familiar darkness she thought she'd left behind. She caught glimpses of herself in mirrors, and saw not the dancer she'd been becoming, but the broken person she'd tried so hard to move past. Alexander's gentle encouragements felt hollow now. His reminders of how far she'd come only served to highlight how far she'd fallen. She began avoiding the hallway that led to the studio, taking longer routes through the mansion to avoid seeing the door that had so recently represented hope. In the quiet moments before sleep, Sophia would trace the scar on her wrist, feeling the raised tissue that marked where everything had changed. She'd been so careful, so measured in her return to dance. But maybe careful wasn't enough. Maybe some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed. They could only be accepted. The dog's steady presence became her only comfort. He didn't expect her to be anything other than what she was, didn't look at her with disappointment or pity. He simply stayed, offering the same unconditional love that had made her save him in the first place. As another morning dawned, Sophia lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of life continuing in the mansion below. Her wrist ached dully, a constant reminder of her limitations. The ballet slippers remained untouched in the corner, gathering dust like abandoned dreams. Alexander watched from his study as Sophia walked past the window, her shoulders slumped and her steps heavy. The dog followed close behind, his usual bouncy demeanor subdued to match his owner's mood. It had been 9 days since her injury flared up, and the light he'd seen returning to her eyes was dimming with each passing day. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Madame Claire, the ballet teacher who had worked with Sophia before. His fingers hesitated over the call button for just a moment before pressing it. "Monsieur Alexander," Madame Claire's warm voice answered. "How is our Sophia doing?" "Not well, I'm afraid," he replied, moving to close his office door. "The injury has flared up again. She's giving up, Madame Claire." There was a thoughtful pause on the other end. Perhaps what she needs is not just physical healing, but a different approach entirely. Would you bring her to the studio tomorrow? I have some ideas we should discuss. Alexander glanced out the window again, watching as Sophia settled onto a garden bench, her injured wrist cradled in her lap. "She's resistant to anything related to dance right now. I'm not sure she'll agree." "Then don't tell her it's about dance," Madame Claire suggested. "Tell her it's about healing, which, mon ami, it is." The next morning, Alexander knocked gently on Sophia's door. She was sitting by the window, absently stroking the dog's head while staring out at the gardens. "Would you come with me this morning?" he asked softly. "There's someone I'd like you to meet with." Sophia turned, her eyes suspicious. "Another doctor?" "Something like that," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Someone who specializes in rehabilitation." She looked down at her wrist, conflict evident on her face. "I don't know, Alexander." "Just one meeting," he pressed gently. "If you don't like what they have to say, we'll leave immediately, I promise." The drive to the ballet studio was quiet, save for the classical music playing softly on the radio. Alexander could feel Sophia tense as she recognized where they were heading, but she didn't protest. When they pulled up outside, Madame Claire was waiting at the entrance, her kind face breaking into a warm smile. "Ma chérie," she greeted Sophia, opening her arms. "Come inside where it's warm. We have much to discuss." Inside her office, Madame Claire poured tea from an elegant pot while explaining her ideas. "Dance is not just about grand leaps and perfect poses," she said, passing Sophia a delicate cup. "It is about understanding your body, working with it rather than against it." She pulled out several photographs, spreading them across her desk. They showed dancers of various ages, some with visible disabilities or injuries, all performing in different ways. "These are my students who found new ways to dance," she explained. "Some could not use their legs, others their arms, but they all found their own path back to the art they love." Sophia's fingers traced one of the photos, a dancer using a wheelchair, her arms creating beautiful lines in the air. "But how?" "We start small," Madame Claire said, her voice gentle but firm. "We focus on what you can do, not what you cannot. Perhaps we begin with breathing exercises, with visualization. We work on strength in other areas while your wrist heals. And most importantly, we listen to your body." Alexander watched as Sophia absorbed this, seeing a tiny spark of hope return to her eyes. "It will not be easy," Madame Claire continued, "and it will not be quick. But if you are willing to try, I believe we can find your way back to dance. A different way, perhaps, but your way." Sophia's hand drifted to her wrist, but this time the touch was gentle, contemplative, rather than frustrated. She looked at Alexander, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the meeting, then back to Madame Claire. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "Of course you are, ma chérie," Madame Claire replied, covering Sophia's hand with her own. "But you are not alone in this journey." After a long moment, Sophia nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try, but slowly this time." Alexander paced in the empty ballet studio, checking his watch for the third time. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, creating long shadows across the polished wooden floor. He'd arranged everything meticulously, the lighting, the music, even making sure the temperature was perfect. Madame Claire emerged from the changing room in her performance attire, her grace evident even in simple movements. "Is she coming?" she asked, adjusting her wrap skirt. "She'll be here," Alexander assured her, though his stomach churned with uncertainty. He'd told Sophia only that he had something important to show her, afraid she might refuse if she knew the truth. The door creaked open, and Sophia stepped in, wearing a simple sundress. She froze when she saw Madame Claire in her dance attire, her eyes widening with recognition. "What is this?" she whispered, taking a half step backward. Alexander moved quickly to her side, gently touching her elbow. "Please stay," he said softly. "Just watch. That's all I ask." Sophia hesitated, then allowed him to guide her to a chair near the wall. Her injured wrist rested in her lap, and she couldn't seem to take her eyes off Madame Claire, who was now stretching at the bar. The studio lights dimmed slightly, and the first notes of Tchaikovsky's The Lake of Swans filled the air. Alexander watched Sophia's face as Madame Claire took her starting position in the center of the floor. Though no longer a young woman, the ballet teacher moved with a grace that transcended age. As Madame Claire began to dance, Alexander saw Sophia's breath catch. The teacher's movements were different from what they might have been 20 years ago. More measured, more deliberate, but they carried a depth of emotion that only experience could bring. She didn't attempt the most challenging technical elements, instead focusing on the artistry, the storytelling, the pure joy of movement. Sophia's hands trembled in her lap. A tear slipped down her cheek as she watched her former mentor transform the studio into a stage, turning simple steps into poetry. Alexander noticed how she unconsciously moved her head in time with the music, her body remembering the rhythms it had once known so well. Madame Claire's performance wasn't about technical perfection. It was about the soul of dance itself. She moved across the floor with intention, each gesture carrying meaning, each pose telling its own story. When she modified certain movements to accommodate her age, it didn't diminish the beauty of the dance. If anything, it enhanced it, showing how dance could evolve and adapt. More tears fell as Sophia watched, but Alexander noticed these weren't tears of sadness or loss. There was something else in her expression now, a dawning realization, a spark of possibility. Her good hand lifted slightly, following along with one of Madame Claire's porte de bras movements, muscle memory taking over before she even realized what she was doing. The music swelled to its climax, and Madame Claire performed a series of gentle turns, her arms creating beautiful shapes in the air. When she finished, holding her final pose as the music faded, the studio fell into complete silence. Sophia sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. Her eyes were fixed on Madame Claire, who slowly relaxed her pose and turned to face her former student. Without a word, the teacher crossed the floor and knelt before Sophia, taking her hands, both the injured and the healthy one, in her own. "You see?" Madame Claire said softly. "Dance lives in here." She placed a hand over Sophia's heart. "Not just in the steps or the technique. It changes with us, grows with us, adapts with us. But it never leaves us, ma chérie. Never." Sophia's tears fell faster now, but she nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. She looked at her injured wrist, then back at the empty dance floor where Madame Claire had just performed. For the first time since her injury, she didn't look at the studio with fear or regret. She looked at it with longing, with hope. The morning light streamed through the studio windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Sophia stood at the bar, her fingers lightly touching its smooth surface. Her reflection in the mirror showed someone different from the frightened woman of weeks past. There was a quiet determination in her eyes now. She thought about Madame Claire's performance, how it had shown her a different way to see dance. Her injured wrist, while still healing, no longer felt like a mark of failure. Instead, it was a reminder of courage, both from saving the dog and from finding her way back to what she loved. "May I?" Alexander's voice came from the doorway. He'd been giving her space these past few days, letting her process everything on her own terms. Sophia nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I've been thinking about what Madame Claire showed us," she said, adjusting her simple practice clothes. "How dance isn't about being perfect. It's about feeling the music, expressing something real." Alexander moved to sit on a bench against the wall, his presence supportive, but unobtrusive. "What will you dance today?" "Something simple," she replied, moving to the center of the floor. "Something that feels right." She nodded to Alexander, who pressed play on the small stereo. The opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the studio. It wasn't a traditional ballet piece, but that was precisely why she'd chosen it. Today wasn't about tradition. It was about rediscovery. Sophia began to move, letting the gentle piano notes guide her. Her movements were smaller than they once would have been, more contained, but they carried an authenticity that made them beautiful. When she extended her injured arm, she didn't push for the full extension she once demanded of herself. Instead, she found new ways to express the music's emotion through subtle gestures and fluid motion. Alexander watched, transfixed, as she created something entirely new. This wasn't the technically perfect performance of a principal ballerina. It was something more intimate, more honest. She moved with the music as if having a conversation with it, her body responding to each note with natural grace. When she turned, it wasn't with the multiple rotations that had once been her signature. Instead, she performed a single, measured pivot, her arms creating delicate shapes in the air. Her face showed no strain, no anxiety about getting everything exactly right. There was only peace there, and something that looked remarkably like joy. Sophia incorporated simple walking steps between her dance movements, making them part of the choreography rather than trying to hide them. She worked with her body's current capabilities, instead of fighting against them. When the music swelled, she allowed herself to feel it fully, her expression revealing every emotion the melody stirred within her. Halfway through the piece, She caught Alexander's eye in the mirror and smiled, really smiled, while dancing. It was something she hadn't done in years, too focused on perfection to experience the simple pleasure of movement. The smile transformed her entire performance, adding a layer of warmth and authenticity that no amount of technical precision could match. As the final notes of the piece faded, Sophia didn't strike a dramatic pose. Instead, she simply stood still, her eyes closed, letting the last echoes of the music wash over her. When she opened them again, she found Alexander watching her with an expression of profound understanding. He rose from the bench and walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet studio. "That was beautiful," he said softly, and they both knew he meant more than just the dance. Sophia looked up at him, her cheeks flushed from the exercise and emotion. "It felt different this time," she admitted, "like I wasn't trying to be who I used to be. I was just being." Alexander reached out and gently took her hand, the injured one, and held it with careful tenderness. They stood there in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming the studio around them, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. No words were needed to express what they both felt. That sometimes the most beautiful things come not from perfection, but from embracing our true selves, limitations, and all. The evening breeze drifted through the open French doors of Alexander's study, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. Sophia stood by the window, absently stroking the dog's head as she gazed out at the setting sun. Her wrist, though still healing, didn't hurt as much anymore. Alexander watched her from his desk, his heart racing. The past few weeks had changed everything. What started as concern for an employee had evolved into something far deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified him. He'd spent his life building walls around his heart, using his wealth as a shield, but Sophia had somehow slipped past every defense. "Would you like some tea?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Sophia turned, offering a soft smile. "That would be nice." As Alexander prepared the tea, something he'd never done for anyone else before, his hands trembled slightly. He'd rehearsed this conversation countless times in his mind, but now that the moment had arrived, all his carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "You seem distracted," Sophia observed, accepting the delicate china cup from him. Alexander set his own cup down untouched. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "about how different everything is now." "Different?" Sophia tilted her head, curious. "When you first came to work here, He paused, gathering his courage. "I was different, focused only on success, on maintaining this perfect image. But watching you these past weeks, your strength, your determination, your kindness," his voice softened. "You've shown me what really matters." Sophia's breath caught as Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "That day you hurt your wrist saving that dog, I thought I was just helping an employee," he continued. "But seeing your selflessness, your genuine care for others, it woke something in me, something I thought I'd buried long ago." The dog whined softly and settled at their feet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Every time I watched you dance, every time you shared another piece of your story," Alexander's voice grew more confident with each word, "I fell deeper. Your resilience amazes me. Your ability to find joy again, to embrace life despite your fears. It's beautiful." Sophia's hands trembled around her teacup. She set it down carefully, her heart pounding. "I know this might complicate things," Alexander continued, taking a steadying breath. "But I need you to know, I've fallen in love with you, Sophia. Not just with your strength or your grace, but with all of you. The way you care so deeply about everything you do, The way you've helped me see the world differently." He reached for her hand, her injured one, and held it gently. "I love how you've shown me that perfection isn't what matters, that it's okay to be vulnerable, to need help sometimes. You've changed my whole world, and I—" His voice caught. "I love you." Sophia stood very still, her eyes wide with surprise. Tears gathered at the corners as she processed his words. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been so afraid to feel anything again. After my injury, I thought I'd lost everything that made me who I was. I built walls around my heart, convinced that if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't get hurt again." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his gaze. "But you saw past all of that. You didn't just help me heal physically. You helped me remember who I am, who I could be." Tears spilled onto her cheeks as she continued. "I've been fighting these feelings, telling myself it wasn't possible, that I wasn't ready. But the truth is—" She squeezed his hand gently. "I love you too. And it terrifies me, but I'm ready to take that chance. With you." The distance between them seemed to disappear as Alexander gently cupped her face with his free hand, wiping away her tears with his thumb. The moment was fragile, filled with all the unspoken promises of new beginnings and second chances. Sophia stood in front of the mirror at the local dance studio, adjusting her simple black leotard. Her hand smoothed over the fabric nervously as she watched a group of young students file into the room, their eyes wide with anticipation. This wasn't the grand stage she once dreamed of, but somehow it felt just as important. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'm Miss Sophia, and I'll be your ballet instructor." The children gathered around her, some shy, others bouncing with excitement. A little girl with unruly curls raised her hand. "Miss Sophia, were you a real ballerina?" Sophia's heart squeezed, but not painfully like before. "Yes, I was," she answered honestly, "and today I want to share what I learned with all of you." She caught her reflection in the mirror. Not the prima ballerina she once was, but something different, something stronger. Her wrist, though healed, would never be the same. But she had learned that perfection wasn't the goal anymore. "Ballet isn't just about perfect moves," she explained, demonstrating a simple first position. "It's about expressing yourself, finding joy in movement, and never giving up even when things get difficult." The children followed her lead, some wobbling, others surprisingly graceful. Sophia moved among them, making gentle corrections, offering encouraging words. She remembered her own first teacher, how those early lessons had shaped her life. "That's beautiful, Emma," she praised a particularly determined little girl. "Remember to breathe. Dancing should feel as natural as breathing." From the observation window, Alexander watched the class unfold. He'd helped set up this opportunity, working with the studio owner to create a scholarship program for underprivileged children who wanted to learn dance. But this was all Sophia, her strength, her grace, her healing heart on display. She demonstrated a simple combination, her movements fluid despite her old injury. The children watched in awe, and Alexander could see why. Even now, there was something magical about the way she moved, something that spoke of both vulnerability and strength. "Now, who wants to try?" Sophia asked, and every little hand shot up. She worked with each student individually, showing the same patience and care that she'd shown while nursing the stray dog back to health. That same dog now had a permanent home with them, a living reminder of how their story began. "Remember," Sophia told her students, "every great dancer started exactly where you are now. The most important thing is to believe in yourself and keep trying." Alexander noticed how her words seemed to reach beyond just dance instruction. She was teaching these children what she had learned through her own journey: resilience, self-acceptance, and the courage to begin again. As the class progressed, Sophia's confidence grew. She moved with purpose, her teaching style natural and encouraging. This wasn't just about teaching dance steps. She was sharing pieces of her heart, helping others find their own path to healing and joy. The children responded to her warmth, their initial nervousness melting away. Even the shyest students began to open up, attempting the moves with growing confidence. Sophia celebrated every small victory, every wobbly pirouette, every brave attempt. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, his heart full. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with. Not just the former ballerina, but the resilient soul who had found a way to transform her pain into purpose. She had taken what could have been an ending and turned it into a new beginning. The class ended with a simple reverence, the traditional ballet bow. As the children gathered their things, chattering excitedly about next week's lesson, several parents approached Sophia with grateful smiles. She spoke with each one, her face glowing with quiet satisfaction. From his position by the door, Alexander watched as Sophia embraced her new role, not as a star on stage, but as a guide for others finding their way. In this moment, she shone brighter than any spotlight could have made her. Sophia sat cross-legged on the plush living room carpet, surrounded by travel brochures and magazines. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the scattered papers. Her newly adopted dog, Max, dozed contentedly beside her, his head resting on her knee. Alexander watched her from his position on the couch, his laptop balanced on his legs as he researched potential destinations. The sight of her, so absorbed in planning their future together, made his heart swell with affection. "What about Paris?" he suggested, breaking the comfortable silence. "You mentioned you performed there once." Sophia looked up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It was beautiful, but—" She hesitated, picking up a magazine featuring the Greek islands. "I'd like to go somewhere new, somewhere we can both discover together." Alexander set his laptop aside and slid down to join her on the floor. Max immediately shifted to rest his head on Alexander's leg instead, making them both laugh. "Traitor," Sophia teased the dog, scratching behind his ears. "The Greek islands look amazing," Alexander said, examining the magazine she held. "Clear blue waters, ancient history, quiet villages." He paused, watching her face light up as she studied the images. "We could rent a villa overlooking the sea." "Really?" Sophia's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I've always wanted to see the Mediterranean." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The casual intimacy of the gesture felt natural now, where once it would have made them both uncomfortable. "We could start in Athens," he continued, "then take a ferry to the islands. Santorini, Mykonos, maybe some of the smaller ones too." He pulled out his phone, showing her pictures he'd saved. "Look at these sunset views." Sophia traced her finger over the image of a whitewashed building against a blazing orange sky. "It's perfect," she whispered. Then she glanced at him with a hint of worry. "But what about my dance classes? I can't leave my students for too long." Alexander squeezed her shoulder gently. "The summer break is coming up. We could go then. Your students will be fine, and you'll come back refreshed and inspired." He smiled. "Maybe you'll even learn some traditional Greek dances to teach them." She laughed, the sound bright and clear. "I'd like that." She pulled another brochure closer. "Look at these little tavernas by the water. Can't you just imagine having dinner there, watching the boats come in?" "We could do that every night if you want," Alexander said. He found himself increasingly eager to share these experiences with her, to see the world through her appreciative eyes. No schedules, no pressure, just us exploring at our own pace. Sophia gathered the brochures into a neat pile, her movements deliberate. You know, she said thoughtfully, a year ago, I never would have imagined this. Planning a trip, teaching dance again, being... She met his eyes. Being happy? Alexander took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. I know what you mean. I was so focused on work, on accumulating more wealth. I didn't realize how empty it all was until I met you. Max shifted position, sprawling across both their laps now, making them adjust to accommodate him. Sophia laughed, scratching the dog's belly. We'll have to find someone to look after this big baby while we're gone. Already taken care of, Alexander assured her. My housekeeper adores him. She's already offered to dog sit whenever we need it. He reached for his laptop again. Should I look at flights for July? Sophia nodded, excitement dancing in her eyes. Yes, let's do it. Let's plan our adventure. She leaned over to see the screen, her shoulder warm against his. Show me more about those little islands, the ones tourists don't usually visit. Together they began mapping out their journey, discussing possibilities and sharing dreams. The afternoon light slowly shifted around them, but neither noticed the passing time, too absorbed in their plans and each other's company. The early morning sun painted golden streaks across the driveway as Alexander loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of his car. Max sat watching from the front steps, his tail thumping against the concrete, while Sophia knelt beside him, giving him one last hug. Be good for Mrs. Thompson, she whispered into his fur. The dog licked her cheek in response, making her laugh. She stood up, brushing dog hair from her sundress, and turned to face the mansion that had become so much more than just her workplace. Alexander closed the trunk and walked over to her, his hand finding hers naturally. Ready? He asked, his voice soft with understanding. Sophia squeezed his hand, taking in the scene before her. The morning light caught the dewdrops on the rose bushes she'd helped tend, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. It was hard to believe that less than a year ago she'd arrived here broken and afraid, hiding her injury and her past behind a mask of quiet efficiency. Do you remember that first day? She asked, leaning into Alexander's shoulder. When you caught me trying to clean with a broken wrist? He chuckled, the sound warm and rich. I remember being terrified you'd hurt yourself worse if I didn't intervene. His free hand came up to touch her cheek. You were so determined to keep working, to keep hiding. I was scared of losing everything again, she admitted. After the ballet accident, I'd lost my career, my confidence, my whole identity. This job was all I had left. Alexander turned to face her fully, his eyes serious. And now? Sophia smiled, looking up at him. Now I have so much more. I have my dancing again, even if it's different. I have my students who light up every time they master a new step. She reached up to touch his face. I have you. The breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. Mrs. Thompson appeared at the door, waving as she called Max inside. The dog gave one last look at Sophia before trotting obediently into the house. You know what I remember most about that first day? Alexander said as they walked toward the car. The moment you told me why your wrist was broken, how you'd risked yourself to save a stray dog. He opened her door for her. That's when I knew you were special. Sophia settled into the passenger seat, watching as Alexander walked around to the driver's side. She thought about how much he'd changed, too. From the distant, wealthy man who seemed trapped in his own success to someone who'd learned to open his heart and find joy in simple moments. As they pulled out of the driveway, Sophia caught a glimpse of the small dance studio Alexander had built for her in what used to be an unused wing of the mansion. Through the large windows, she could see the ballet bar where she now practiced and taught. the mirrors that had witnessed her journey back to dance. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she said softly. "Like I have a purpose, like I belong somewhere." Alexander reached over and took her hand as they turned onto the main road. "You've always belonged, Sophia. You just needed to believe it yourself." He smiled, glancing at her. "And now we get to start a new adventure together." The mansion grew smaller in the rear-view mirror, but Sophia didn't feel the usual pang of anxiety that came with leaving familiar places. Instead, she felt excitement bubbling up inside her. They were heading to the airport, bound for Greece and all the discoveries that awaited them there. "Thank you," she said suddenly, causing Alexander to look at her questioningly. "For noticing me that day, for caring enough to help, for showing me that sometimes the end of one dream can lead to something even better." Alexander lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you for teaching me that true wealth isn't about money or success. It's about having someone to share your life with, someone who makes you want to be better." The morning sun streamed through the windshield, warming their faces as they drove toward their future together. Behind them lay the past, the broken wrist, the shattered dreams, the lonely mansion. Ahead lay endless possibilities, a love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning, and the promise of many more mornings just like this one.